As we settle into this pre-Purim Shabbat tonight, many of us might be already thinking about the ways in which this year's Purim feels a little different against the backdrop of current events. We've been talking about it, maybe you've been reading about it, and this just sort of feels like a big part of our experience this year. La Yehudim hayta ora, we read, v'simcha v'sason v'ikar. The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness and honor. We say those words every year. But if I'm being honest, I'm not really feeling that light or gladness as I think about being Jewish right now. If anything, there's actually a different phrase from the Megillah that feels more apt to describe the world Jews inhabit today. V'na'afochu, meaning the opposite happened. I think v'na'afochu is actually an excellent tagline for 5784, because let's face it, this entire year has been the opposite of what any of us could have expected when we sat down for shul on Rosh Hashanah. As the CBE clergy braced for a new year, we gave sermons about newness and about not being afraid, and insisting that the Judaism we practice here is one of joy and progress and depth. And that ebullient spirit lasted about 2 weeks, maybe a little more, until October 7th cast a pall over the year we had anticipated. And yet, on Purim, we read at the end of the Megillah, La Yehudim hayta ora, the Jews enjoyed a bit of levity. We are not the first generation of Jews for whom this phrase is an aspiration more than a reflection of reality. And we must find a way to make it so. As we've been talking about for weeks, and as I alluded to at the beginning, Jewish communities like ours are struggling with the end of the Purim story this year, since the conclusion of the Megillah includes a tale of violent revenge that's unacceptable for us in a time when Jews actually have a state, where power is not a joke or an abstraction, and where today right-wing elements of a very real government are calling for violence that's anathema to the values we hold dear. Tomorrow, when we actually hear the Megillah out loud, we'll try to remedy this fact. Many of us will choose not to boo or shout or throttle our groggers to blot out the names of our enemies during the latter portion of the story. But tonight, I want to remind us that for many, many centuries, the murderous end of the Megillah story was so incomprehensible to Jews that the whole thing was written as a literary farce. It was preposterous because it was beyond the pale of anything Jews could anticipate actually becoming true. And it is precisely because of this, because the Esther tale represented a then impossible story for Jews, that Purim remains an indispensable feature of the Jewish calendar, even now. The Jews of antiquity needed light and gladness, happiness and honor, and we still do. So we celebrate a holiday with a story in which we can imagine a seemingly ridiculous conclusion. Perhaps it's time now to imagine yet again a different ending, even one that seems ridiculous or far off in light of contemporary geopolitics. Purim is our yearly opposite day, living in the yet-to-be-established world in which our people and all peoples might be safe and free. It makes sense that we should sing that La Yehudim verse from the Megillah each Saturday at Havdalah alongside Eliyahu Hanavi, which speaks of the Messianic age, because it reminds us of the imagination required for each of us or all of us to turn the pains of our present into a future of joy. As we frequently say on Shabbat and at other holidays throughout the year, it may not be intuitive for us to feel joy this week, given how increasingly terrifying this Jewish moment feels. But that's precisely why we must. Not just to take a break from it all, but to give ourselves the space to imagine something better. The strength of Purim has always been its emphasis on imagining what is yet to be. In the Talmud, we read that in the Messianic age of the future, when most Jewish holidays become obsolete, Purim will still be celebrated. Perhaps it is in Purim's spirit of imagining that the rabbis understood it to be fitting for the world to come. It can be very hard to enter the realm of imagination. And for this reason, somewhat questionably, our rabbi suggests that we might as well get drunk to help us get there. Many of you seem to have learned that one already. We know that the Talmudic sages advise Jews to be so drunk that we can't tell the difference between the phrases, "Blessed be Mordechai" and "Cursed be Haman." All right, get it out now. We should be so drunk, perhaps, that the boundary between enemies and friends becomes blurry. But people forget that the reason why is that we have a taste of what will one day be, vanahafochu, yet again, a time when there will be no more adversaries of the Jewish people, and when the Jewish people will never wage war against any people, and when the world will be at peace. It is true that we inherit a violent story, where the imagined climax comes when the gallows that Haman erects for hanging Mordechai is used to hang that person instead. But here, I want to return to a teaching that I shared a few years ago here in this space at Purim. According to the Sfat Emet, a Hasidic sage, the presence of that gallows in the Megillah represents more than merely the topsy-turvy world in which Jews are improbably victorious. For him, the reversals of Purim are a harbinger of the world to come. Bear with me on this one, it's going to get a little weird. In the Megillah, we read that the gallows that man prepared were 50 cubits high. The Sfat Emet notes that 50 is one more than 49, which is true. And the Rabbi or Rabbi teaches that 49 is the number corresponding to the human realm, since it is the number of arguments a rabbi can make either way to determine if something is pure or impure. But 50, being one higher than 49, is a number that symbolizes an experience higher than purity or impurity in the physical realm. 50, again, bear with me, 50, in his view, represents a realm in which there is only purity, a time when goodness prevails in the world. In other words, 50 is a number representing the world to come. And therefore, there's something within those gallows that has a taste of the world redeemed. It is morbid, it is bizarre, it is disturbing for us. The gallows is the ultimate detail we typically leave out when we tell our children about the Purim tale. Still, according to this teaching, the gallows here represent a time when gallows will never again appear on earth, and when the light of Torah will pervade the world. In the future, we might actually forget the difference between our friends and our foes. None of us have ever actually lived in that world, but this is the season of our imagining it. It is reasonable that we are presently afraid about the state of the world. It is right for us to pray for a world made whole, where Israelis and Palestinians live as neighbors in peace. And in our desire to make the world more whole, Purim comes to remind us that doing so is impossible without the sacred work of imagining, without believing that the unreal can be made real, and that the future really will be better. Imagining and creating anew are embedded in our spiritual DNA. In this week's Parsha Vayikra, we begin a lengthy section of Torah devoted to the Judaism of temple times, namely the Judaism of sacrifices and priests. According to Maimonides, the sacrifices of the past were necessary in their time to root out pagan practices among the ancient Israelites. But the genius of the early rabbis, according to Rambam, was to imagine a future that was more elevated than physical sacrifices, to give the Jewish people a religion they could practice in their own time, encountering God in a new way. Reading the Parsha through the lens of Rabbinic Judaism, we see clearly just how far we've moved beyond what was. We see our ability to incubate change, and we see the imaginative power of the rabbis that is our heritage. It was the rabbis who insisted that Purim be celebrated among the Jews of the world, that the Megillah should be included in our Bible and read publicly every year. And it's the Megillah that inspires us to dream up something better, which we can then enact. Tomorrow, we will read the traditional text of the Megillah, with a few sections that, like the ancient sacrifices, are no longer things that we can abide in 2024. that as we read those challenging verses, we can recognize in them the dreaming of our ancestors. The fact that they allowed themselves to dream is far more important than the specific dreams they dreamt. We too must allow ourselves to dream, to imagine a better ending to our story, for us and for all peoples. Shabbat Shalom.